Hey, good morning to you wherever you're at, watching this on YouTube, Tumblr. You're not watching this on Tumblr. We're not live on Tumblr, but we are live on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube. Maybe you're watching this on Rumble or you're listening to it on the Success is a Choice podcast feed. I am your host, Jamy Bechler, for the Talent and Strategy Show, made possible by our friends over at Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. Check out all their services at affinitytoday.com. As usual, we have Ruston Pierce joining us, as well as my co-host. He's president of consulting for Affinity Recruiting. Ruston, good morning to you.
Good morning. New year, new microphone. I'm ready.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate that. That's awesome. Your other podcast, we will we'll go ahead and pimp that out. We'll go ahead and give you a little free plug. But your other podcast that you have going on is the Vol Bros. The Vol Bros, whatever you want to say. I'm not an SEC person.
You're such a northerner. You butchered Vol twice. Like, it's hard to mess it up more than once. You did it twice.
Ruston and his brother do some podcast allegedly about SEC football, about a particular team in the SEC in the South. We all know that all the SEC teams are good. We all know that pretty much college football belongs in the South, but give us a little plug for this podcast that you do that is just taking the world by storm.
It is, and it has absolutely no reason to. But it's thevolbros.com, and we have all kinds of merchandise. It's just for fun. It's actually not just football. We talk about all things Tennessee athletics. We even tweeted the other day about swim and dive. I mean, come on, who's covering swimming and diving? So we cover all kinds of stuff. It's just for fun. It's funny. It's lighthearted. It is unbelievably unprofessional. And, for whatever reason, people are gravitating to it, and it's doing really, really well. And it bought me a new microphone. So, hey, that's got to count for something.
I love how you said you have merchandise. You have merch.
We do.
You have merch already. So, the Vol Bros.
Volbros.com. We had a lady tweet a picture of our hoodie from Las Vegas the day after Christmas. She said it was her favorite Christmas gift.
Well, excellent. Well, I appreciate you doing that show, because there is a need for that. Because the one thing I've always thought of is there's just not enough talk about SEC football out there. So
there's always room.
They always get overlooked. Nobody's ever talking about SEC football. So thank you for bringing something to market that really there's a need for.
Swim and dive
in the SEC. I'm sure they do well, as just like all their other sports. But our main guest today, the special guest that we have, Jason Sowash. Jason is the president of the Human Resources Outsourcing division of Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. In other words, if you don't want to handle human resources, or you can't handle human resources at your company, which is the case for a lot of people, then Jason is the guy you want to call. So Jason is on the show to tell us all about human resources, where you're messing up, where you can do better, and maybe some alternatives and ways to take your HR game to another level. So Jason, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. Good morning to you and Ruston.
Yeah, good morning. So a lot of us, we know HR from maybe a couple different standpoints. We know HR from, they're the people that tell us rules all the time, or they're, they're the ones that I had to go sign, a million pieces of paper for when I get hired at a job. Or if you're a real human being, you've watched the show The Office and Toby from HR. Mm-hmm. So that might be the extent of people's knowledge of HR. Give us kind of a 30,000 foot view about HR.
Certainly. So, it's funny because you brought up all the things that people think about when they think about HR, and how HR has evolved so much. HR started as a shopkeeper 100 years ago, basically trying to manage his people and trying to figure out the best way to manage his people and keep talent, in-house, that kind of stuff. And it has truly evolved. We really saw it evolve, as different regulations and federal regulations and laws were enacted, especially during the mid to late 1900s. Obviously, COVID took HR to a whole different level as far as the interaction HR played across multiple divisions within a company. But as you mentioned, all those things you just mentioned, I mean, HR really does have their hand in everything when it comes to hiring, firing, and everything in between. I'm sure we'll dive more into the specifics of all those. But yeah, there's not much that HR doesn't touch.
So Jason, so I get the benefit of watching what Jason does all the time, and I deal with nonprofits all over the country. Jason works on both sides. He deals with for-profit and nonprofit, and all of them need human resources help. I've yet to come across an industry that doesn't need human resources help. So Jason, from your perspective, why would someone outsource their HR? What would be the benefit of that?
Great question. So there's several ways to answer that question as well. Primarily, as you well know, Ruston, I'm looking at companies that are typically 100 employees and under. For that reason is typically because they have someone in that organization, Betty or Bob, who started off in the warehouse and has been there 15 years, and he's gradually moved up. And they're like, oh, well, the entire company, and we need somebody that can handle, just employee relations. So we're going to slap an HR title to you. And I see that every day, especially in the manufacturing and production world. I really see that a lot on the profit side. And so why people need HR help is one reason that. Two, you have a lot of owners out there that are continuing to try to do all this on their own as they develop a company. I was just talking to a steel manufacturer. They actually make rolled steel. So it comes in and they make different products for sheet metal. He has about 200 employees. He has one person in his HR trying to handle hiring and firing and everything in between, end of the year as far as, assessments and paperwork for each employee, handling 401ks, payroll. I mean, that HR person is overwhelmed. She really is completely overwhelmed. And he and I had a very good conversation. So it's not just where someone needs HR help as just 100 and under. Like I said, he has 200 employees and he needs a lot of help. He doesn't need the help. His HR person needs all the help. And that's really why people outsource. People outsource for a couple different reasons. One, as I just mentioned, they have somebody in-house, but they're overwhelmed. They don't have time to really function on their key jobs. And so they need to offload some of that. The other aspect of this is really in the nonprofit world and the 100 and under employees where they don't have an HR person at all. And that's where we come in and say, okay, we're going to take all this off your plate. So now the owner, instead of signing up for 4 different websites, because another responsibility that HR typically has is to hire people, to go out and find talent. And so we're going to eliminate that off your plate. No longer are you going to go to 20 different websites and search for people and things like that. We're going to consolidate that for you through not only myself, but also the other team members we have within Affinity. And then we take that to the next level where they still conduct their interviews. And after the interviews, that's where I step in and say, okay, you're ready to onboard this person? Yes, we want to extend an offer. I electronically send an offer letter. They're like, wow, you can send that via email. Yes, that's possible. Once they sign the offer letter, do you want to go ahead and do all the onboarding paperwork? Yes, I'll send that all electronically. We just simply take the processes that are broken and just try to make them better. So that's really why a lot of people outsource. It's not so much that we're saving them a ton of money, even though I believe that our costs are less than hiring an individual to be your HR person, but we're really saving you time. That's the benefit of outsourcing HR, is no matter who in your organization is doing all these things, they probably have 10 other functions that are lacking because they're not doing these functions. And that's what we offload to ourselves.
So I got a follow-up to that, Jason. And,
Yes.
and, sometimes in HR, they deal with employee issues, things that, it could be a discrimination type thing. It could be Title IX. It could be any kind of legality type thing or confrontation, maybe between employees. Is that able to be outsourced? I know that might sound like a stupid question, but I'm curious because if somebody is concerned about litigation, if someone's concerned about liability or risk, would they then turn off the idea of outsourcing because maybe that can't be outsourced and that might be my greatest headache? Or is that just one area of HR that wouldn't be able to be outsourced, but that's okay because you're still going to save all this time in these other areas? Talk me through. I know it might be a dumb question.
No,
I
it's
don't
not.
know.
No, it's not at all. I think I'll start with, I'll mention COVID several times because it really did push a lot of things outsourced, not just HR, but other aspects of the company forward, realizing, remote workers can actually work from home and still be productive and trackable. I think with companies realizing that you can use things like Zoom and different vehicles like that to interact with employees, that's very possible. I'll give you another good example of exactly what you just talked about. I have a client. I won't name the client, but they're in southern Tennessee, Pulaski, Tennessee, and they wanted to terminate an employee. And I have traveled there periodically so that people know who I am. They know that they've outsourced their HR. They called this employee into a room. I was on the screen. I very politely explained to him that his employment was no longer needed, and he was being terminated, and that I made it very impersonable because unfortunately it's personable to him. But I'll give you a reference. There was a movie, Moneyball. Whenever they're talking about in the movie, they're talking about whenever they had to trade somebody, you bring them in, you state the facts. Here is your separation paperwork. I'm going to be emailing that to you. Along with that, here's your severance package. I explained all that. I explained his 401k, what to do with that, and who to contact. I took his. There was something else his time, his PTO they had built up. Went through all that with him, just as if he and I were in the room. And we went through that. Took some time, and then after the end, I forget. I won't say the person's name. I said, "Mean Joe Green is right outside the door, and we'll escort you to the lockers." This was a production manufacturing facility. You'll clean up your locker, and then you'll be escorted off the premises. The owner afterwards said that was one of the easiest terminations he's ever had because he didn't have to do it. Well, number one, but number two, it flowed very well. So no, to answer your question, that has become a very normal thing, even though you think it wouldn't be, to outsource that.
I think what you just said is really valuable for anybody who's watching in literally any industry, because I think one thing I would add to Jason's response is kind of piggybacking on what he said earlier. A lot of times the person in the HR role isn't credentialed or qualified to be in the HR role. Mm-hmm. I see this all the time in nonprofits. Somebody's administrative assistant was a really nice person and needed more to do. Okay, let's put her over HR. In different industries, like Jason mentioned, you'll see people who have been there a long time. They've been promoted to multiple roles, and it's like, oh, well, they know everybody. Put them in HR. Mm-hmm. And so now you're in this scenario where you are having to terminate, or you're having to hold somebody accountable. The person doesn't know what they're doing. Doesn't do it the way Jason just said, and starts getting into details, which you never want to do during a termination. And all of a sudden you're liable, and you've got an opportunity for a wrongful termination lawsuit. You've got all kinds of things in play, where if you outsource it and you have the right processes in place, you've added another layer of protection for your organization that wasn't there previously. And I tell people all the time, how big of a lawsuit's going to be big enough to take you down? What would it take? Are you covered for that? Can you withstand that? If you did get sued for wrongful termination or discrimination or something like that, would you win? It's amazing how many organizations can't answer those questions well.
It's very true.
Jason, so I'm curious, kind of along those same lines, what are some mistakes or some pitfalls that are common that you see HR managers or companies make in the world of human resources?
Great question. Obviously, keeping up with current federal and state laws and regulations, making sure all the required trainings are done properly, and recorded properly within an organization. One of the things we do is obviously not only are we outsourced, we come on site yearly if the company wants us to and conduct 2 days of training where we're not only just coming in and doing standard training, but we're also bringing in your benefits coordinator, your broker to talk about your insurance. And those who aren't enrolled, discuss that. If your company wants to offer benefits, then we bring that person in basically anytime to sit down and talk to the owner and describe, what we can do as far as, we talked about time management a minute ago too, to go back to that. For a HR person who's overwhelmed or an owner of a smaller organization to sit there and try to figure out, can I offer benefits? If I do, where do I start? Blue Cross Blue, different organizations may be higher than others. And it's overwhelming. So I'm just not going to do it. Well, when you don't offer benefits and you don't offer certain things, you're losing talent because your competition in that market in your area is offering those things. So it's important that, as you mentioned, pitfalls, Ruston, keeping up with regulations, keeping up with understanding what is going to attract employees and then retain your talent. The other big thing, I'll throw out another one just because it happened again recently. I was sitting there with, I lost my train of thought. I can't think of it now. It'll come back to me here in a second. I'm trying to think what other pitfalls we see major. Besides regulations, that's always a big one.
So I'm curious, you mentioned a minute ago a company that had 200 employees and one HR director. I get this question a lot, so I'm curious what your perspective is. How many people can one HR person handle?
It depends on the processes you have in place is number one. If you're flying by the seat of your pants, probably no more than 20 people. If you really have structured processes, after you get about 50 people, you want to look at potentially either outsourcing or hiring a second person into your HR department. For every 50 to 100 people after that, you want to have another one. So that 200 should have at least two, I call it 2.5 FTEs. You can't cut somebody in half, but that's pretty much where you're at. 2 people and an assistant in the HR.
So I think that's a really valuable number that you just said, because I think that number for a lot of listeners, especially business owners, that number probably is surprising. And it aligns with the number I heard once. I heard an HR professional that I have a lot of respect for. I asked her that question and she said a high caliber HR director can handle up to 100 employees, but she's going to spend her entire week doing payroll and benefits. Yeah. So if you want anything else done, you're going to have to outsource that or hire someone else, because, she basically said the same thing you did, that 50-ish is about when you really need to start thinking about how do the rest of our processes get done. Mm-hmm. And I think that number probably would surprise a lot of business owners.
Yes. Yeah, because most of them are not functioning that way across the board, and not just in HR, but as far as leadership and different roles. And nobody wants to be top heavy. I get that, but you in order to grow, you've got to have the right management in place.
But like what you just said, if you don't have those systems and processes in place, it may save you a little bit on the bottom line there, but you're going to lose it on the bottom line in other areas where you're falling short because you haven't done a good job with leadership development, with coming alongside and putting good retention practices in place that allow those employees to be a part of your organization long term. And people sometimes forget that. They go, oh, we're going to save over here in this HR world, but then they end up spending on hiring over and over and over because they can't keep anyone.
Yeah, very true. I'll give you that you brought up processes, and that's what I was thinking of earlier. So currently have a potential client I'm working with that conversation got into, and this is really where the consultative HR approach comes in, where I come in and I've been in HR a long time, about 14 years totally helping, consulting with, started off with hospitals, running telemedicine programs, all the way down to really focusing more on HR specific. And I said, do you do continuous process improvement? And they said, what's that? And I said, well, how often do you do pay raises and do reviews with your people? And they said, once a year. And I said, during that year, do you realize all the chances you're missing to grow your organization, understand where your junior people are, not just having meetings with your management and above or your leadership or mid management and above, but continuous process improvement is, something as simple as putting a suggestion box in the break room. And that's very start, but that truly could be a start. And you actually read those and then take those and work on those and figure out, why do I have a group of employees who are saying this? And so that continuous process improvement is just that. It's constantly looking at ways that we can improve not only our culture, not only our product, but also our culture. And that just gets lost because so many HR people are slammed, or owners who are trying to do the HR function are just too busy.
So we've talked a lot about hiring. We've talked a little bit, touched upon that in various parts so far in these few minutes we've had together. What are some strategies, tips, advice that you would have for HR people or business owners when they're looking at hiring people?
Great question. You want to put everything that is positive about your company first. I mean, I'm hoping that most people who are listening today know this. If you have, the 401k in a match, you want to list that. You want to stack your benefits. And when I say stack your benefits, that's not just your truly quote unquote benefits, but the reasons why somebody should come work for you. That anybody gets there and read a job description. It's in the details of, if I come to work there, what is that culture like? Especially as you're looking at people. I mean, I've done some seminars and conducted some seminars on, age differences in the workplace. And, as you're looking at hiring someone that's 20 versus 50, you've really got to stack those benefits for that person who's 20. They want to know what the culture is like, what type of time off, do you have, that kind of stuff. So it's important that when you're looking for talent, from that aspect, you got to really sell yourself. And there's a lot of companies out there that don't sell themselves. They think that they're really good, and they might be. But if they're not selling themselves, they're not going to get the top talent. That would be my number one thing that I see most out there, is just that they're not bringing in the talent. And they come back and like, we're hiring and our turnover rate's horrible. Well, let's look at the hires you've made and why did they leave? What happened in the front end recruiting part that drew them here? Did you do an exit interview? No, I didn't do an exit interview. If you're not doing an exit interview, then you're not learning. Most people will be quite honest in an exit interview if they know they're leaving. Sometimes too honest. And that could actually be a good and bad thing. Mostly all good. So there's things like that you should put in place that help you narrow down to find that ideal candidate for you.
What are some things that companies should be aware of when they're going through the recruitment process, when they're going through the onboarding process? What are some red flags that they should watch for as they're trying to bring in new employees?
There's always the standard ones. The people who job hop. If you see employment that is every 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, and it's consecutive that way. That's obviously a red flag. Those that immediately come out and only want to discuss compensation. Biggest thing is anytime that I've interviewed for a company and they've asked me to hire people for them, or at least be part of the interview process. Anybody who walks in the room and doesn't have a question for me is looking for a job, not a career, not something that's going to be, hopefully, at least 5, 10, 20 years, is going to be a great employee. For me personally, that's what I always look for. They come in, did they actually investigate the company? And they came in with questions about the company. If they come in and like, how much am I going to make? And, that's pretty much it. Then that's a red flag for me. I'm sure you can elaborate more as well. I'm trying to think of all the red flags that I see. That's probably the biggest one.
So that question thing, as an employer, that was something that always stood out to me. I would pay a lot of attention to the people who would walk in and interview me as the employer. That spoke volumes to me. If they truly, and I had somebody, a really wise advisor once, tell me, anytime you're looking at a new position, do your homework thoroughly And when you walk in, they are not interviewing you, you are interviewing them.
Yeah.
And you make sure that you are absolutely going to be a great fit there. So you're not doing this again in a year and a half.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think there's a ton of value in that.
No, there is a ton of value. I'll tell you a good interview question. And people always laugh when I say it, but I really want them to think off the cuff, and it's not a question that typically gets asked. Anybody I ever interview for a company, I'll ask them, I said, if you could be any animal, what would you be? And I'm curious, it's always great just to always the ones that take 10 minutes to respond, unless it's a really deep, they've really had some thought put into it. One of the best ones I had is I was hiring a salesperson, and he said, I want to be a blue whale. And I said, why do you want to be a blue whale? He said, because I want no borders. I want nothing holding me back. I want to be able to just go, and I want to have a vast array of opportunities that I can go after. And I don't want any predators, that can get me. And we had a long conversation about it. We probably spent 15 minutes on that conversation, on that question. And it was a really good interview. And I suggested to the owner that he hired him, and he turned out to be a really good salesperson for the company. But so that just questions that make them, that aren't standard, come up with the questions that aren't standard. If you're the interviewer, on this side trying to hire someone, that always helps.
Well, let's flip it around. You got an employee that you don't like. Sometimes I have a really, really lazy employee, and in my business, my self-employed business, sometimes I have a really lazy employee. Sometimes I have a really demanding boss, depending.
Jamie's trying to figure out how to fire himself.
I'm trying to figure out if I need to outsource some HR to have some intervention here. We might need an arbitrator to go between the boss and the employee here. But now someone could be thinking, yeah, that's called marriage counseling, because I've been reminded often that 50% of my business is my wife. So I tell her she's on the line for 50% of the business debt that I have. But anyways, Jason, if you've got this employee that you don't really like, or they're not getting the job done, what should businesses be doing? What should bosses be doing?
I mentioned it earlier. I think a continuous process improvement plan for individuals works as well. You can do it as an organization and come up with, milestones and things you want to hit, but how do you hit them within each different segment of your business? But you can also do a continuous process improvement with an employee. There's nothing wrong with sitting down with an employee and saying, hey, we're having a verbal conversation right now. And here's why. Honesty, and take emotion out of it. Again, they're going to get emotional potentially, and that's okay. They're feeling attacked. They're supposed to feel that way, or they're typically going to feel that way. The idea is you have a process. I think I mentioned earlier, Navy veteran. I think the military gave me that structure and process that lives in my body today. Every company needs to have a process, no matter if it's 2 verbals then a written, or 3 verbals and a written, whatever that is. And they need to have forms ready to go, that they can sit down with an employee and go, hey, we're just having a verbal conversation right now. Here is, here are the comments from your supervisor. We really want you to succeed here. And so here's what we want to see from you. And at the end of that, you always need to ask, what do you need from us? Because maybe that employee feels like he or she is not being taken care of properly. And maybe that's true or not true, but at least you want to hear that. As I mentioned about the exit interviews a lot of times are very emotional, and people say a lot of things that necessarily maybe aren't even the truth, but there's half truths in that. So you really need to dive into those. And the same thing there, you want to hear back from the employee, where are we failing you? Where are we falling short for you, the employee? And then you explain the process again. Here's a verbal. We're hoping this corrects itself. We're hoping we can help you in any way. And, here are the people you need to come talk to if any of these issues exist. And, give a timeline. If this doesn't improve by this date, we're going to have another meeting. And that meeting may be a written counseling. And after that, then you can discuss in the written counseling what the time frame is. And so they understand that, there's a process involved, but you're taking the time, not just, here, sign this. I've seen that. The supervisor walks up going, hey, you were late, you need to sign this disciplinary form. What good does that do anybody? I mean, you throw it in a file and that serves no purpose. All it does is actually demotivate the employee. Process. That's what HR should live on. That's what every employer should live on.
I hate to beat a dead horse, but that also goes back to what you said at the very beginning about who's doing your HR. You know, when you're hiring an HR person, it better be a detail-oriented, process-driven individual who is actually going to execute all the steps that you just said. I see that all the time. They've promoted somebody internally, or they've just named somebody an HR person. They're not process-driven at all. And so the execution part of everything you just mentioned doesn't happen. Now you've got lack of documentation. Now you're open to more liability. You know, there's so many things that come with that if you don't have the right person in that seat.
Very true. You know, and it doesn't have to be, you know, we talk about HR all the time. It doesn't have to be something that is, you know, we just made it sound very regimented and not a lot of fun. HR can be a lot of fun. There's some things within HR that even I get to do even as an outsource. Sometimes when a small organization says, hey, we want to put on a hot dog, you know, or a chili cook-off at our company. And they'll say, hey, you know, when are we allowed to do this? And what are the parameters? You know, what are any type of state, you know, federal, you know, regulations we make sure we don't cross, that kind of stuff. I've even had owners come talk to me about Christmas parties and what should be allowed and not allowed. And you know, it can still be fun. It reminds me, again, I'm more of a movie buff. The lady from Christmas Office Party. If you guys have seen that with, I can't think of his name. Anyhow, it's a good movie, but they have an HR. So it's a very fun company, and they have an HR person who's not a lot of fun. And she's constantly quoting out about, no, you can't do this, or no, you can't do that.
What would we need to do to make a national law or a federal law that you can't be forced to wear an ugly Christmas sweater at a Christmas party?
Yeah.
Or at a employee luncheon?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
that's the kind of hard-hitting litigation that Congress would definitely want to get behind.
They would.
Well, Jason, I know that you're a big sports fan, and kind of merging the two, sports and HR, we see this often that maybe a coach, and we'll stick with a coach, but a coach gets in trouble, or a coach does something and maybe they're suspended, or, you know, something happens. And we just recently saw this with the University of Texas with their basketball coach. Chris Beard was arrested for domestic violence. And we don't need to get into the exact situation. We can, if you want. There's so many out there like this. But more to the point, the question is, what are some things, if you're in charge of a business, you're in charge of an athletic department, you're the person, the buck stops with you, what are some considerations when things happen legally, or when things happen that are maybe unethical and they're not an exact, you know, you can't it's not an automatic firing. Maybe there's some he said, she said, maybe there's some interpretation, maybe there's some things you got to dance around. What are some considerations when you're in charge that you should be aware of?
That's a great question, because as I'm sure Ruston can elaborate even more on the consulting side, you have to be very careful. You have to investigate. You can, you know, as you've seen, especially in the police forces, unfortunately, across the country, you know, they are, you know, put on leave, some with and without pay. A lot of times you need to consider that depending on the circumstances. You know, as you mentioned, what I've seen, you know, unfortunately, I've seen, you know, employees get into a physical altercation. That's a termination. Who started it? A lot of times, if they both are getting physical at that point, and it can't be determined, a lot of times both are terminated. But if there's situations like, you know, he said, she said type of thing, sexual harassment is nobody wants to talk about it, but, you know, a sexual harassment, you need to be very careful and investigate before you start, just like you mentioned, automatically firing or automatically letting go. And that really falls on that, you know, falls on the head of understanding, you know, the laws in your state and the federal guidelines surrounding that, but also doing your own due diligence and understanding and getting as much information as you can before you make any decision. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, we're going to send you home for the next week with pay, maybe without pay, depending on the circumstances, while we look into this. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And that's typically within federal and state guidelines to do so. So I would just say understand or hire somebody or outsource to somebody who understands those federal guidelines and can direct you on how to do that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is also, and I think college athletics, large college athletics, does this really, really well. Always have a communication plan before you start doing anything. Really think through how you're going to communicate, because people are going to ask questions. They're going to, even if you're a business owner and you have to, suspend someone with pay or without pay for a certain period of time, people are going to ask, where's so-and-so? Why aren't they here? Is the rumor I heard true? So having a very general communication plan that is completely fact-based, does not allow for any form of, scrutiny, or doesn't have any gray area in it where people can invent things, and being very consistent with that will help in those moments where you might have to have, you have a he said, she said type scenario, and there's not a clear answer yet. And, I think a lot of businesses probably, for fear, most likely don't have a good communication plan when stuff like that happens. And so they just allow their employees to, sit and create whatever they want to create, rather than addressing it on the front end proactively, and even going so far as to say, this is how we will discuss this as an organization until we have clarity, and really kind of giving everybody the company line per se of, this is how we're going to address this. And if it's something that's, a really big deal and potentially has some legal ramifications, even going so far as to saying, this is our company line on this, and we will not discuss it otherwise. Yes. Just so everybody else understands, if you get caught talking about this scenario, there may be some repercussions for you too. Again, I think major college athletics a lot of times does this really, really well. Maybe better than most other organizations, because they've got the money to put behind it and make sure that they dot all their I's and cross all their T's.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, you've had really good insights here today. What I want to do is let's go ahead and let's get some final thoughts. Ruston, we'll start with you. You've had, you can take this in whatever direction you want. If you want to go with your favorite TV show, The Office, and talk about some of the lessons learned from there. But, if you've had a lot of different roles, worked with HR a lot. So let's start with you. Final thoughts about HR, some things we should all be aware of, and then we'll go to you, Jason, to wrap it up.
HR gets a very negative rap, and it makes sense. Typically it's all about avoiding lawsuits, avoiding legality. I think the most important thing I would take away from this is, I hope people are truly listening to the things Jason's saying and asking good questions about their organization, and going, how do we do processes? Who's handling them? How well are we documented? If heaven forbid someone did sue us, are we covered? But then also asking questions around, that head count we mentioned. Is our HR person overwhelmed just doing benefits and payroll all the time? And does that person actually get to be the HR director, or are they a glorified bookkeeper? I think that's a big question people need to wrestle with and go, what do we want to do? And, we talk a lot on here about leadership development. A big part of a human resources director's job should be creating leadership development programs. And, if you don't have that person engaged in that activity, your organization's suffering.
Yeah.
Jason, how about you? What's your big takeaways?
Yeah, no, I would mirror everything you said. I mean, obviously, I don't know how. Hopefully, we've given some little nuggets to some people out there considering what to do with their HR. I will say, if there's anybody out there that's listening from an HR perspective, outsourced HR isn't there to necessarily come in and get you fired. I see that a lot I run into a medium-sized organization, and someone says, the owner's like, yeah, he or she needs a lot of help. And then they bring that HR person, whatever title they have, into that conversation, and they immediately get very defensive. Oh, you're trying to get me fired. You're trying to take over my job. No, I'm here to support you. In your organization, they need you here on site. You're big enough that they need you on site to handle some day-to-day stuff. But what can I take off your plate so that you can actually function better? And let's look at your processes. So for any company out there that's looking, again, should I hire somebody? Should I, get online and look at an online, human resources portal to try to do this, or should I outsource this? It's worth a conversation. If nothing else, sit down and figure out what's the best for you. I've walked into organizations where I said, you're big enough that you really need somebody on site more than what I can probably provide. I'm here to help you. I can help you hire that person. I can do a lot of things for you, but I necessarily don't have to necessarily work with me long term. So the biggest thing is just, if you're evaluating it, talk. Reach out and say, let's have a meeting and let's talk, and just figure out what's our best approach.
You're muted, Jamie.
We appreciate the knowledge that you've been dropping, Jason. We appreciate those insights, Ruston, as well as usual. Lots of experience, lots of background that you can draw from. So anyone out there watching this, be sure, get in touch with Jason if you have questions about HR. He'd be glad to serve as a great resource to you. Or if you want to even look into further about the outsourcing, check him out. His email's in the show notes as well, or it's Sowash at affinitytoday.com. Everyone, we appreciate you listening, watching this live, or watching it on replay. We will be right back here next week, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern time on Friday. So we appreciate it once again. Thanks for the support. If you would kindly go ahead and hit that little subscribe or notification button, that little thumbs up, some way just to let us know that you're watching, that you like the show. That also tricks that algorithm into sharing it with other people that might like this as well. So until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?